Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our next episode of Mixed Messages with Jeff Bogue. My name is Joe Caruso, and I'll be your host as we dig into today's topic. Well, from news sources to comedians, from friends to advertisements, it seems everyone has an idea of how we should think and live and make our decisions. And when even the experts sound convincing but they disagree, how do we cut through the noise? And how do we sift through all of the information overload and choose what actually governs our lives? Our leadership here at Grace has been processing these things and praying for all of us, so we want to offer a resource to navigate some of the day's most pressing topics and questions. Jeff, how we doing, buddy?
Good, Joe.
Excellent.
Doing well. So fantastic.
Oh, wow. Maybe we're having a counseling session today, Jeff.
Yeah, maybe.
Tell
That's not a
what's...
bad idea.
Oh, my goodness. I don't think you're lying, but I don't think it's that simple either.
You know, it's funny. I think everybody feels a version of like my mind's exhausted in their life right now, because I think supply chain issues, the economy, cultural change, COVID still very much around. Like I just think like you go to work, you're dealing with these crazy, unusual things in home and school, and so I'm just relating to everybody. That's the way I feel.
Well, I was going to say right before you kind of explained yourself that speaking of shoving down your feelings, today's topic is toxic masculinity.
Oh, done.
But then you wouldn't explain yourself. And
That's right. There's nothing wrong with me.
That's right.
I'm fantastic all the time.
Yeah, so that actually is today's
Feelings
topic.
are for girls. You didn't know that, Joe?
If you'd like to submit questions and mixed messages. So we're going to dive into this topic about toxic masculinity and what does it mean? How is it misunderstood? Are there elements of the toxicity that somehow we're called to? How do we navigate this? Because our culture, I think a lot of our culture, I should say, continues to push that there's this overbearing toxic masculinity that's happening all over the place. How do we deal with that as the church, as Christian men, and kind of wade our way through these waters?
Yeah. I think you have to start with the term.
Sure.
And so toxic masculinity, the question is who gets to define that?
Yeah.
And so I think what I have seen a lot is that masculinity is often defined as toxic.
Yep.
And I think that's sometimes it's unfair. Sometimes it's almost a reverse prejudice a little bit, and then and then sometimes it is toxic masculinity. There's a perversion of masculinity. So a toxic masculinity, in my definition, so I think we have to define the term.
Yep.
So in my definition would be something like the abuse of power, over-sexualized, the macho-ism, the I don't have feelings and I don't deal with them, and everything that's artistic is not manly, and that kind of stuff. So that's a toxic masculinity. And then there's variations of that. Anything abusive, anything that's lording power over someone weaker because I'm a man and you're a woman, or I'm a man and you're a child. That's the toxic side of it. I think what happens a lot of times, though, in our culture, and I'm probably going to get pushback on this, so I'm prepared, but is being a man, our culture is often feminized. And so being a man is often considered unacceptable in some arenas of our culture. And to that, I would disagree. I remember for years ago, and this is like in the 90s, like way back in the day, there was a thing going around, all men are pigs, and so it was a joke, all men are pigs, and men would say all men are pigs, and then they'd come to me and they're like, well, all men are pigs, and I would actually say, I'm not a pig. In fact, if you call me a pig, you actually really insulted my wife, because now I guess she's stupid enough she married a pig.
Yeah.
So I'm not a pig. I'm a man. My sex drive does not make me a pig. Me viewing the world differently than my mother or my wife does not make me a pig. Me having the strength to disagree with you does not make me a pig. Me having a different emotional process than you have does not make me a pig.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting when 9/11 happened, which is 20 years ago now. It fascinated me that there was a push on toxic masculinity. This is not a new conversation, but then suddenly we needed men to go to war. And we were like, go be a man, go defend us, go fight for us, go protect us. And I'm like, that's interesting that now suddenly, because we need you to be manly, that we're changing the terms of the conversation.
Well, it's kind of like what you were saying when you were like, we got to define the terms, because
right.
if masculinity needs at times to be described as toxic masculinity, that would certainly imply that there's a different kind of masculinity that's not toxic. But if you just throw it all together, you get confused real fast.
And that's my point, right? So there's times that you want me to be masculine, right? And there's times that I go overboard with that. There's times I go underboard with that. Like I just read an article recently about an inner city school that was having fights on a regular basis. And these men, fathers, formed, I think it's called the Dad Squad or something like that. You guys can Google it. But fathers started showing up at school. There hasn't been a fight since. Right? So like what happened is men acted like men.
Yeah.
And they went and they're like, you know what? The problem is that there needs to be leadership and strength on display, and it suddenly settles school down. Now, I don't think that's toxic.
Sure.
I do think that's a very masculine response to something, and it was good and it was needed. You know, I think toxic masculinity is when I have a child or two with a woman, and I won't marry her, I won't live with her, and I won't raise my kids.
Right. Yep.
So she has no choice but to be a strong, aggressive mother, because your sex drive was toxic, and you will not accept the responsibilities of being a dad. I don't think that's because that woman's weak. I think it's because that man is, and that is actually the toxic part of it.
Yeah.
Where even if there was a divorce or you decide never to get married, if that father was actually involved, the weight it would pull off of the mom, where they're sharing that weight, as opposed to having it dumped on her. So I think that is as toxic as you're a little woman, do what I tell you to do, submit to me because God said position, and using possibly my physical strength and presence, my words to control, to manipulate, and all the rest. So I think that's why that definition matters to me, because I actually think that a big part of what's wrong in our culture is that men aren't being masculine. We're not using our strength to love and serve and help.
Yeah.
And I think most women would say, if you're talking about masculinity in terms of loving, serving, helping, I'm all for that.
Yeah.
Like, it would help me to not have to parent the children alone. It would help me to not have to be the sole spiritual leader of my house.
Yeah.
That would help me.
Sure.
If you're talking about power and control and sexual and unhealthy sexuality and manipulation and abandonment, that's not just toxic masculinity, that's toxic humanity.
Yep.
Absolutely. I'm not trying to parse a word. I'm really not. I'm not trying to dodge an issue at all, but I'm like, it really, really matters what is meant when that term is thrown out there.
Yeah, that's really good because there might even be people listening right now that are having a hard time parsing the difference between the two, especially based on what they've experienced. If they've had that unhealthy person, especially in a close relationship in their life, they're going to feel a lot of those, pauses in life when it comes to dealing with other men, simply because, gosh, if that's what being a man is, I don't want nothing to do with it.
Yeah, and the tragedy is most men don't have an example of a godly man in their life. I mean, statistically, that's the way it plays.
Sure.
And so they don't know. They've never had modeled for them when to utilize their strength, etc. And so they would say, they might think, if I'm the leader of my home, it means I have to get control of my home, and I have to make sure that my home does what I tell them to do. And I would push back, and I would say that's not what that means at all. That what it means is I'm first to sacrifice. I'll bear the weight of a difficult decision. I absolutely listen to, love, and serve my wife, and I take responsibility for my home. So if something is unhealthy, whether it's my wife, my children, myself, I'm the first to step up. I'm the first to own that. I'm the first to bring change. I'm the one who invites my family into spirituality. I'm not drugged there by my wife. I'm the first to sacrifice, the first to give. And that might be like the kids malfunctioned on mom, and dad steps in, not in anger or rage, but says, hey, honey, do you want me to handle this? Would you like us to handle it together? I'm not undercutting anybody's authority.
Yep.
But I'm not abandoning my wife or my children because I don't feel like dealing with it.
Yeah.
To me, that is a partial description of healthy masculinity. And as a man, I should be willing to bear the most weight if necessary.
Yep.
Right? Now, somehow that got turned into tell my wife what to do. And Ephesians 4 and 5 is very, very clear that we submit to one another. Submission is not gender specific.
Right. That's good.
So we give the best of ourselves to one another. And as a dad, as a father, as a man, I am the first to sacrifice and the first to care. But I also see things differently. So Heidi and I have a great relationship. Heidi is a very strong, very smart, very capable, very independent individual. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I like that.
Sure.
That's the kind of girl I like, So like we're a great couple that way. We see things differently.
Yeah.
And I value the way that Heidi sees it. The flip side of the coin is Heidi values the way I see things. And then I would say that ultimately there are times that Heidi will say, this is my opinion. And I'm like, well, this is mine. And she'll say some version of, it's your decision, but I don't agree with you. Mm-hmm. So I'm now looking and saying, am I willing to bear the weight of the leadership role my wife just gifted to me or gave to me? Mm-hmm. She's saying, I'm in. I'm not going to undercut you, but I do not agree. Mm-hmm. And so the weight of that conviction, right? Yep. And that I see the toxicity being more a dad that or a husband or a man that won't do that.
Yeah.
That sees something negative or painful happening in his home or in the world and stares at his phone and walks away.
Right.
And to me, that's the toxic part of it. But that's the way I'm defining the term.
One of the things that I feel like you're saying without yet saying is
I feel like this is a leading question, Joe.
It is. You gifted me that when you said I could be the host of this podcast.
No, that's true. Touche.
But when the leadership that happens in the home, it's something that, what are we leading to? Because if we're leading toward we have to accomplish all of these things as a family. We have to do these things as a family. Or are we leading our family toward health and relationship and connection and the same elements with God? Because if it's all about the productivity, well then, hey, family, get behind me. We got stuff to do. Versus I'm trying to lead my family to be a healthy family.
Yeah.
And so it's a very different mindset on what that leadership and what that, in this case, manliness would mean to that husband or to that father.
Yeah, I like to say that the great parental privilege is power. So I as a parent, I have authority. I have power over my children. I'm not, especially when they're children, right? I can pick a 6-year-old up and I can move them where I need to move them. Now, I can do that because they're annoying me, or I can do that because they're about ready to run into the street. Mm-hmm. But I have a strength and I have a power that they don't have. Healthy masculinity is that. I have a power, maybe it's physically, but I have a power emotionally. I have an authority that I believe is granted by God, that the husband is the head of a home. Mm-hmm. But I'm not using that to pick a 6-year-old up and throw them in the room because they're getting on my nerves. I'm using that to stop them from running into traffic. So I use what God has given me for the benefit of those that he gave me to lead and protect.
That's great.
Right? When I use it selfishly, that's where you head down a path of masculinity. And in a healthy marriage and relationship, a wife and children should be able to count on that from dad. Mm-hmm. Aside from blowing it, like all of us are going to do, like dad's general disposition is he's going to use his power and his authority to benefit and to protect me. Yeah. That does not take power and authority away from a woman or a wife in this scenario. That doesn't mean Heidi doesn't have power, because Heidi has the same privilege. She has power and authority, right? What that does is say, if somebody's going to take a hit, dad's going to step to the front of the line. And I think in culture, in a healthy masculine culture, a church, a community, that's what men should be doing. Mm-hmm. And that's why on like 9/11, most of the firefighters and police officers who were lost that day were men. Not all, but most. Mm-hmm. Most of our soldiers, not all, but most, were men. We make that heroic. We're like, they use their strength. They use their power to protect and to sacrifice. They stood in the front of the line. It's not that women don't or shouldn't. This is not like men and women. It's not even a role thing. We're just talking about toxic masculinity.
Right.
So just two men in this conversation, I'm like, that's what that looks like. And that's what Jesus looked like. Jesus was extremely masculine. Mm-hmm. When you look at who he squared off with, and you look at what he would not back down from demons to Pharisees, he would not. The Jesus playing soccer with a child is not a real accurate portrayal of Jesus. Mm-hmm. You look at his endurance of the cross. You think about like, I always remember being a kid when my dad would smash his finger or something. He never cried, and I was like, "Whoa, what is that?" Well, he wasn't being macho. He was just a grown-up, you know? Sure. And so I'm like, but I look at Jesus and I'm like, right. that was masculinity on display, given as love and service and protection and help. And so it's celebrated.
Yep.
You know? And we could, on another podcast, we could have this whole conversation about femininity.
Sure.
You know? So I think it's a really big deal. And I actually, I don't think that's always celebrated in our culture. I think what's celebrated a lot is that if men aren't going to be pigs, they need to think and act and feel like women. And I'm like, I disagree with that.
Yeah.
I also disagree that if you're musical and artistic, that you're not masculine.
Sure.
I'm like, David killed tens of thousands of people and wrote poetry. Mm-hmm. So, right? And you're talking to a musical, artistic guy.
Yep.
You know? So I don't think it's like hunting, fishing, killing, and everything else is some version of feminine. But all of that, our culture tries to categorize us. Mm-hmm. And I think as Christian men, we shouldn't allow ourselves to be thrown into those boxes.
Yep.
And if I'm looking at Jesus as my example, I'm like, yeah, he just was first in line.
Yeah. I love that. And I love how Jesus does give us so many of those great examples, because even when he did, you use the playing soccer with kids motif, like Jesus understood the power that he had to invest in others. And that's another thing that you kind of addressed is like a part of being a man is making sure that you're raising up the next generation, whether it's your own children, niece, nephew, kids in your neighborhood, whatever it is, you're a part of being that healthy example for others.
Yeah, and when those kids don't have father figures, to be able to trust another godly, safe man in their life is a massive thing. And I even would look at, you know what I think one of the most critical male figures in a family is the oldest brother. And I think that oldest brother sets a pace. That those siblings, because your little siblings idolize you and they will copy you. And so all you're doing is saying, I'll go first. And I'm aware that that's happening. And so I'm going to try to capture that and help them with it.
I think that's a role that I think in the conversations I've had with people, and to be quite transparent, even in my own siblinghood, like I think that one's overlooked. I think that's a great challenge to continue to encourage those older brothers to look at, because it can be incredibly powerful. Yeah. And for someone that sits as the oldest in our family, you can forget it. You can kind of just go about living your life and they're just my siblings, but they've told me, I know that exists. Like, no, we look to you in those ways.
Yeah.
And, it's a big deal.
My big brother certainly did that for me, and this is a little bit of a rabbit trail kind of, but like that's where like a toxic version of that is, I'm your big brother and you're an idiot and I beat you up all the time and you're more, and a godly version of that is, I'm a big brother and I invite you and I check on you and I pick you to be on my team. And you know, it's the same thing. Like when you are first in line to serve, first in line to sacrifice, first in line to protect, you often wind up being first in line to lead. Yeah. And if servanthood's above you, leadership's beneath you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know? And so it's versions of that. It's not going to come out perfectly. But this is what I would say. I think when this term is used in our culture, it's usually used as the oversexed, over-controlling, egotistical guy. And I think that is toxic.
Yep.
I think it's equally toxic to be passive, to be distracted, to be a perpetual child, to be 35 years old and addicted to video games. to surrender spiritual leadership to your wife? Why is she begging you to come to church or begging you to be in a small group? Why isn't it the other way? Why does mom pray and do devotions? Why aren't you doing that or sharing that, right? I think that is equally toxic.
Absolutely.
And I think it's two sides of a narrow path. And a godly, strong man is looking for that narrow path that honors Jesus and looks a lot like him.
That's really, really good. Now, let's build a scenario here. If you're listening and you just really haven't had those examples, maybe you had an absent or bad father, maybe your brother was closer to the description you just gave of addicted to video games, kind of absent from being a part of the family. Maybe you've had the bad boyfriends or the bad friends or the bad whatevers. And you're like, Jeff, this sounds nice and all, but my experience truly is that every male in my life has been toxic.
Yep.
Where do I go to get the refreshing view of what we're describing here?
Ideally to church. And so you're looking for somebody in your spiritual community that you can look up to. And it's probably somebody older. And you're just looking and saying that what I would do is I look around and I'd be like, that guy's kids love Jesus and his wife loves him. I should buy that guy coffee. Like, whether he knows it or not, something worked and he got the outcome that I want to have, and I have no idea how to do that.
Yep.
That is an ideal scenario. Another ideal scenario is to simply band together with a few of your Christian brothers and say, none of us have really good dads. Let's study the Bible. The Bible is given to us by a Heavenly Father who's a really, really good father. Let's look at this. Let's look at Jesus. Let's try to figure out a little bit how this played out in real time, real life right now. And I think in a loving environment, all that happens. It's Heidi and I were talking one time. We had gotten together with some friends at somebody's back porch, and just had like a summer night little dinner thing. And as we were there, it didn't dawn us at first, but once we got there, it dawned on us like, oh, these are all of our kids' friends' parents. So in some ways, the kids were closer than the parents were as a unit. And we had a great time with them. We were driving home, and I told Heidi, I said, our kids are unbelievably blessed that they have these godly women and men in their life. And the parts of dad that dad's not good at, Mr. So-and-so is good at, where he's got a blind spot, Mr. Such and such is that. And I'm like, our kids were raised by a church family of people that really do love Jesus and really are seeking to walk with him. And because we're all sinners and imperfect, when you put those 4 or 5 fathers and mothers together, I'm like, our kids got something special out of that, And so... But guys, listen to me. If you're listening to this, it's why you go to church every week. It's why you serve. You have to play the odds, and you have to have your family in that environment. And it's why you don't take seasons, football season, baseball season away, because your kids don't hang out with those parents. They only hang out with the kids and the coaches. And then you don't talk to those people again until the next season. You have to create these environments, and it's not a guarantee. You're just playing the odds. But you're able to have your children around men, and I'll add women in there who offset those weaknesses. If I'm a single mom, if I'm a dad who didn't have a dad, I'm leaning into that as hard as I possibly can.
Yeah.
Because I'm probably learning dad stuff as my kids are learning dad stuff.
Yep.
As we go away. So you don't mimic those guys. You don't, we do whatever Joe does. I don't do that. But it's like you're just picking it up, and you're like, oh. Yep. You don't have to scream at your kid to get them to listen to you, huh? Like for many people, they're like, I've never had my mom not scream at me.
Yep.
I don't even know what that's like. It's that kind of stuff. And the body of Christ it's not perfect, it's not a guarantee, but it can help a lot in that stuff.
That's awesome. And this is going to be something that we're always striving for, because as you said, the church isn't perfect, but it is more full of people that are trying to continue to follow after Christ and be changed by Him. If you have follow-up questions to this, or if you have a different question in general, we would love to get to those and continue to discuss these different questions that kind of boggle us from time to time, or where things are confusing. If you have one, you could submit it at bath.gracechurches.org/mixed messages. And if we can help you, maybe it's getting connected to community, maybe it's finding some mentors in your life, or even finding a place where you can kind of give of yourself and maybe step into one of these scenarios where folks need that type of investment and mentorship. We'd love to help you take those steps. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe and follow, rate, and review our podcast. And if you're in the area looking for a church home, we'd love to have you join us here at Grace, or online if you're away as well. Well, thanks for jumping in with us today as we continue to seek God's voice through all the mixed messages around us. Catch you next time.